It's
Hi Dan. Hi,
Hi.
Sally. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank
Thank
you for
you.
joining us today. I'm Elizabeth. I'm Sally's editor at New Harbinger, and I'll be helping guide today's event. Unfortunately, Ruth Lanius can't be here today due to a personal matter, so I'm filling in for her as the moderator. We're here today to celebrate the release of A Brilliant Adaptation and to hear from Sally Maslansky and Dr. Dan Siegel. We'll spend the first half in conversation, followed by audience Q&A. You're welcome to submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature. Please note this is a separate feature from the chat and can be accessed in the sidebar on your screen. It looks like a little box with a question mark. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can in the second half. So moving on to introductions, Sally Maslansky is the author of A Brilliant Adaptation and a psychotherapist whose memoir explores dissociative identity disorder, trauma, and the healing power of the therapeutic bond. Dr. Dan Siegel is a psychiatrist, educator, and longtime mentor to Sally, known for his work bridging neuroscience, attachment, and healing. Sally and Dan, do you want to now take us into conversation?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Sally. Thank you, Elizabeth.
So, do you know what I was thinking that maybe, and you can disagree, that maybe a good place for us to start our conversation is, in the title of my book, A Brilliant Adaptation, How Dissociative Identity Disorder and the Therapeutic Bond Saved Me. And so a big part of that title includes you, and as does the book. I mean, you you I first heard A Brilliant Adaptation from you in an incredibly wonderful context. And the therapeutic bond is really what the whole book's kind of about in my mind, the healing. And also in your foreword, which is so beautiful, you say something so profound. And to me, it's so much the essence of what therapy is about, and treating someone with DID is about. The relational, it's the relational forces in a young child's life that creates the atmosphere for DID to possibly develop. And it's the same force of relationship that can heal, not just DID, but therapeutically, pretty much everything. So I was just wondering if, I'd like to talk a little bit about what that was like for me coming into you in such a terrified state of mind, and how you created safety for me. And then hear some of your reflections about what it was like to treat me, especially in those early days when I was so terrified and often not present in your office. What do you think?
That sounds fabulous.
Okay. So, I think it's really important, both as a patient and as a therapist now, to let people know that when I came to you, I had no idea what was going on with me. I just was terrified all the time. And I will preface that with saying that I was scared all my life, but not terrified in that way. So scared was different for me, more normal. And I think when I first came in to see you, you just met me right at the terror. You didn't try to discourage me from being terrified or explain it away. And I think one of the first things to talk about is how you just knew it didn't make sense after we talked. And you'd known me a little bit anyway before, from when we brought Sam in to see you, and knew that I had a pretty good life and that my son was fine. And I think one of the huge safety features was the way that you helped me get to what the terror was, which started with the adult attachment interview and those questions, which invited me really to look internally for the answers myself.
Yeah.
Can you reflect on that? How you thought that, I mean, I don't need to tell you how to talk about it. You talk about it.
No, that's beautiful, Sally. And, it's incredible to be here with you in this moment with this magnificent book that you've created and contributed with incredible courage for the world. And I appreciate that people are on with us at this moment from all over the world.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that planetary thing was the beginning. You and Paul went to Romania
Yes.
to adopt a child, and you found Sam. And that's how you and I first met, as you're describing it, because I was the co director of an infant and preschool clinic at UCLA where you brought Sam to be evaluated.
Yes.
So that was the first setting, you as a mom, and you and
Mm.
Paul as parents of this new wonderful young boy, Sam. And then the next phase was you calling, saying you wanted to go beyond just the evaluation of Sam, where he said he's doing great, to check in on your concerns.
Yes.
And so, in terms of your question about the therapeutic relationship and how that bond started, I guess my experience as a therapist is that it's really about how we connect with our client. We have the privilege to begin a journey with them, in seeing where things will unfold. So that space of openness in me, even though we had done the evaluation of Sam and it was in that setting we began our connection, now you were saying, I have these things going on. So I think for me as a therapist and any therapist listening, it's just about, how we can receive whatever is in the present moment with the person we're with, but then also having a feeling about potential, about possibilities that the individual may not even know about.
Mm.
And so that's not like fixed answers or ideas. It's more about being open to questions and explorations where two people, the client, the therapist, you, me, we're going to go on a journey together, not knowing exactly where we're going to go. Um, so I see, as we're talking and I'm looking at your face, Sally, I'm seeing a lot of people are saying they can't hear anything. So
Oh.
I hope someone, maybe Elizabeth or somebody, can give some technical advice. I don't know. I don't remember Crowdcast that well to know how to turn it on. But at the bottom, you can turn on things. So I want to make sure you're hearing what Sally has to offer for those who are having technical problems. Yeah. So anyway, that's how I would begin. To begin with a lot of openness and positivity, and just seeing where things unfold without a fixed idea of how things are or where they should go.
And it's so beautiful, and it completely mirrors what my experience was, that you didn't put anything on me. You let it unfold within me. And I think even though I didn't know, I had no idea what was going on. And then it wasn't too long into the beginning of our therapy that I started to understand that there was something going on. And because of the work we did with the AAI, especially, I began to understand that it most likely had to do with my history, my childhood. And that exploration started. And then I think that another thing that you did that started to really make me feel connected to you and safe, that I could talk about anything, was some of the psychoeducation that you offered. And the first one I remember that sort of blew my mind was when you explained about implicit memory. And it's such an important term for therapy, for therapeutic relationships, and for me in particular, because when you explained that implicit memory is the kind of memory that when we have it, we don't know we're having a memory. Right? The memory is very much in conscious awareness, but the awareness that it's from our history is not in awareness.
Yeah.
And suddenly that really helped me start to regulate, because even though the memories were intrusive and not real clear, just filled with terror and uncomfortable feelings, it didn't make the memories that were coming to me any easier, but it made me understand what was most important to me in that moment, that I was not crazy. I was not crazy. And I would often ask you if I was crazy, and you always said no. You always said no.
I would say no, and I remember one time saying to you, "You're the opposite of crazy."
Just the opposite, yes. And that's when you said,
Yeah,
when you finally diagnosed me with multiple personality disorder in 1991 was
yeah,
the diagnosis. And I said, well, so then I am crazy, because everything I knew about that, seemed crazy. I wasn't a therapist. I had no education in this field. And you said, no, it was a brilliant adaptation. And
yeah,
that's truly taken off that. I mean, it's the name of my book, and it seems to be very much in the atmosphere now.
yeah. Well, yeah, and to give a teeny bit of context for 1991,
Okay.
so, in our at least American society, we had a number of things going on. In the 80s, well, in the 70s and 80s, the field of psychiatry, the field I was trained in initially, was really pushing for kind of a medical model of
Mm.
mental health. And,
Yes.
I was very unsettled by reducing the mind to just brain activity. And so for me, trained as a scientist and then trained as a physician and then a clinician, I decided to train in attachment. So when we met in 1991, I had just finished my attachment fellowship, where I had studied the adult attachment interview. And then I was just asked to be the training director in child and adolescent psychiatry. So, and I ran that clinic where we met, and trained folks. So I say all that because that was the beginning of the decade of the brain when you and I met.
Mhm.
And there was a push for the field of mental health to pathologize everything and to think everything was like a genetically oriented disorder. And also, just to put a context on it, unfortunately, my field, child mental health, had accused parents of causing
Yes.
autism and causing schizophrenia by their behaviors, which was absolutely not true. And maybe it was done with good intentions by the clinicians, but it was wrong. And it led to
Mhm.
incredible suffering
Yes.
on the parents' part. So in the 80s, there was kind of a push not to talk about trauma and not to talk about abuse, and so I was like filled with all that stuff.
Yeah.
And yet I had been in the 80s seeing people who actually went through trauma. So when you and I met, I understood Sam's experience being raised initially in a Romanian orphanage, what that might imply for his attachment system, for his brain, for how he could catch up, which he has done beautifully because of you, and Paul, so because of neuroplasticity, which is how I
Yes.
was trained in medical school by my neuroscience teacher, David Hubel, which is all about how experience shapes brain structure. Um, so when we met, it was against the general push of psychiatry to stand up and say, look, trauma is real. Trauma can affect children and stay into adolescence and adulthood. And we need to not put our heads in the sand about it and have the pendulum swing all the other way, even though it does not cause autism, even though that's what was said, parenting experiences. But parenting experiences like abuse and neglect
Yes.
and lead to all sorts of things like, disorganized attachment, which was just being really explored in a deep way in its relationship to dissociation. So those are all new. So just so everyone knows, as the decade of the brain was beginning, also the field of attachment was discovering these profound ways where we had, in a research fashion, empirically shown when you give this terrifying experience to kids, it fragments their mind. And so
Yes.
that's when you and I met. That's the
Yeah.
context. And that's even
Yeah.
before the false memory, quote, syndrome, unquote, which ended up to being just not really a clear thing at all. But we were just meeting before that really started,
I
actually.
remember. Yeah. I remember
Yeah.
when that started, my first awareness of the false memory, and how you just handled it very well with me. I don't, it's not that you assured me I don't think you ever even addressed it directly, except from the way you were treating me. I knew that I was not suffering from false memory syndrome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at the same time, and you bring up the implicit explicit memory, I mean, my own uh, exploration of that in the early, well, in the mid 80s, and my research fellowship in the late 80s was to understand memory systems in the brain and how they affected development. So when you and I met, this distinction between implicit and explicit memory could
Yes.
help us understand how you embed things, you encode things in the brain. But early on, certainly before 18 months, but even after that, if you swamp the hippocampus and don't allow explicit memory, the kind we usually think of I'm remembering a fact, which is dominant in the left, or I'm remembering an autobiographical experience, where I know now I'm retrieving it. Oh, yeah, this happened in the past. Implicit, when it's pure implicit memory, can just be a feeling. It can be a bodily sensation. It could be a perception. It can even be a behavioral response. So that,
All
was
of which I
something.
was experiencing
Yeah.
big time. Yeah.
Yeah. So you and I together could make sense. And it was really important to be able to say, and for any clinicians listening, I I should not and didn't, but it was important from an ethical point of view, say to you, oh, your lack of, explicit memory
No,
means you were
yes.
abused. No, we don't know that because 20% of the population has a lack of explicit memory of childhood. And from our research, they're not abused. They're just an emotional distance, a very different
Yeah.
thing. So anyway, so all that was happening in 1991 when we
Yeah.
began, you know.
And I remember, I think it was when I went to visit my parents, and I can't remember if you had diagnosed me yet or not, but I was clearly being bombarded with stuff from my childhood after some months. And I wanted to go see them because I wanted to see what it felt like to be with them in the room now that I was having all these memories. And they weren't clear pictures. It was feelings and perceptions and odors and it was very ambiguous. And it was when I came back from visiting my parents where things became extraordinarily clear for me that I was actually able to come back to therapy. And I knew that I had been abused as a kid because it just became crystal clear for me in that room. And that's
Yeah.
kind of where things really started to unfold in terms of the states showing up.
Yeah, and
Right?
and I remember that moment, and features about it and how, intense it was for you. Yeah.
Yes.
And
Oh, yeah.
and in terms of, um, communicating, I had to be present for your experience and keep an open mind. Are these implicit memories arising, you know, accurately depicting something that happened, or is it an imagined scenario about it, or is it real? So we could keep an open mind. And as things unfolded and other data points came in from other family members, and also clear explicit memories arose, it started to become clear. But for any clinician listening, you know, as long as this is not in a court of law, the idea is for me to go with you and just be with what arises and not worry about the issue. Is this exactly what happened? Is this, but rather be with the experience. And in that being, then, you can start making sense of stuff that before, like, as you mentioned in the book, when you first came, you said your childhood was fine. I said,
Yes.
well, tell me about it. You go, I don't remember it, so that's
It was a
that.
huge moment for me. I mean, it's shocking. I shocked myself. Yeah, yeah, and it
Yeah.
shocked me not as much that I didn't remember my childhood because I always knew I didn't remember my childhood, but that I did that I could say, oh, I had a good childhood. But then what really was shocking to me was that I had never, and I was 37. I wasn't a young kid. That it had never seemed to be something that I needed to look into before. Yeah.
Yeah. And, as I mentioned, 1 out of 5 adults in the United States, at least, can't remember their childhood.
Yes.
And that's the avoidant attachment passing on to the adult dismissing attachment. And that's quite different. The lack of encoding is what I think that's about, is very different from what you experienced, which is, an emotional turmoil and
Yeah.
terror that fragments the mind into states of mind that you're bringing up. And what do you remember about what that was like? I mean, one thing we're talking about is, okay, I don't really remember my childhood and I didn't even know there was anything wrong, but I'm worried about my son. But now
Right.
there's another layer of getting, a diagnosis there that,
Yeah.
I tend to avoid diagnoses, but sometimes when things are really complicated and, it's helpful to have a frame, especially in those days, it was called multiple personality disorder. We had the data to show, you had to have some very significant abuse or neglect before the age of 7. That was early, it was chronic, it was intense. That's what the research has shown about multiple personality disorder. And then separately, the field of attachment had shown that disorganized attachment, is a predictor of dissociation, which multiple personality is based on. So anyway, so that was all happening then. But what was that like for you to, start becoming aware that there was some process we can name as dissociation? We'll see what words we would put to it, states and all that kind of stuff. But what was it like for you?
So I remember that day really well. It was very upsetting to me on one level that I had this thing called multiple personality disorder, which I only knew from the popular culture, and it was very upsetting that that's what I had, based on what I knew about it, which was not much. It, but I also very clearly remember being relieved. Now I knew what it was. I knew I wasn't crazy, because that's when I said, does that make me crazy? And you said, no, it's a brilliant adaptation. So I had a roadmap. I knew we had something to work on. So it was helpful. It was really helpful. Yeah. Ultimately, it was hard to talk about. I think I didn't know how to talk to Paul, my husband, about it. And not because I was afraid, I just didn't have the words. And you discussed it with him, and he really understood it and was very supportive on it. And then,
I
I mean, we didn't talk about it a lot after that. We just
Yeah, I
did the
I
work.
gotta say, because I was thinking about that before we were getting on today. I remember that time talking alone with Paul,
Yeah. What was
and
that
what a
like?
sweet person he was, how
You know,
devoted he was to.
Sam's on the thing
Oh, he
with us
is.
today.
Oh,
Yeah.
hi, Sam. Hi, Sam.
Nice.
Paul, your dad, he was so devoted to you guys, to Sam, to you, and he was so intelligent. And he said, let's talk about it. Tell me straight. I don't want you to, soften this. Just tell me what it's all about. And, we decided, you, Sally, and I decided I would have a private session with Paul so that he
Yes.
could speak very directly without, having to modify the way he would speak, and you had an incredibly supportive partner,
Very
and
supportive.
Sam had an incredibly devoted dad,
Yeah.
wonderful human being. So I remember that, and it was
Yeah.
like, because I've been in the opposite, where people
I'll
refuse
bet.
to
Yeah.
believe it and they're like this. So it was, for any clinicians listening, it was a dream of a partnership.
Yes. And
It's
so
there.
important in my ability to do the work, that he was so supportive, in every way, in
Yeah.
every way.
So what I don't, that moment, Sally, when the idea of dissociation and these somewhat, segmented self states of mind, self state meaning, a state that has enduring qualities of, emotion and its regulation, patterns of thought and what has meaning for that particular state, and even behaviors. So I use the term self state for that verb like cluster that falls under the term personality. So we can understand where the multiple personality term comes from.
Right.
But dissociative identity disorder, the dissociative identity part makes sense. The disorder part is used just because it creates a lot of havoc in the person's life.
Right.
So it's hard, but the idea, if it's a dissociative identity response, as some people are suggesting, is a much better term, because it's not like a disorder that anyway, the disorder term can be used in different ways, but the idea of it is it's a response to overwhelmingly terrifying experiences early on in life, but now you are now coming to learn about it.
Mhm.
Um, it wasn't your intention. It wasn't your idea. It was not even in your, way of
No.
thinking. But here it was. What was that like for you?
Well, at that moment, I realized I had a lot of work to do, right? And but what the diagnosis did, and the way you treated it and spoke to me about it, and helped me with, help Paul understand it. It made the, even though, I mean, and I really want to stress this because sometimes I think I talk about it and I might make it sound like it was too easy. There was nothing easy about the work of uncovering the different states of mind that held the terror for me, because they all, on some level, not all of them, but most of them were born out of this terror, this terrorizing family that I was growing up in. But what it did allow me to do is to, I could go inside, right, and I could check in with myself and find out what part had something to contribute for me to learn about in a particular session. But in the very early days of our work, and maybe sometimes always, but eventually this ended, I would come into a session, I would lie down on your sofa, remember, and I brought a blanket, and I would and what I remember very much in the early days was I would come to therapy. I'm not sure, and I know sometimes I did show up at therapy because we had talked about it and I wasn't present. It was another state that I wasn't aware of because of the memory barriers. But sometimes I would come, I would lie down, we would start talking, and then another state would appear or show up, and I would disappear, and then I would wake up, and the session would be over. And I don't remember you ever telling me what happened in a session. You always encouraged me to look inside, to journal, and find those answers for myself, which I did. And so it became a routine. I mean, I would just come in and we would just go right to work. But what was it like for you? And I'm saying this for therapists out there, as a therapist, to be in a room with Sally, who you knew, and then another state came up and I wasn't present anymore. What was that experience?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many layers, and for some reason, I want to start with this layer because you started as a mom with a dad, with Paul, the dad, and Sam. You know, I- we began our connection through the family unit, right?
Yes.
And because I'm trained as an attachment researcher, for me, I'm always thinking about like, how is this therapy now that you're in therapy as an individual going to affect Sam as your
Yes.
son? How's it going to
Yes.
affect the family dynamics? And so, just so you know, that's in me. But now you're in the office, just you and me.
Mhm.
Um, and as you started out saying, my childhood was fine. There was no agenda you had except that you were terrified about what was going on with Sam. But then it
Yeah.
really was being terrified of what was going on in you without you even knowing that's what it was about.
I remember very specifically saying in our very first session that I was terrified. How would I ever explain to Sam about how his life started? And truly, it was how my life started.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So, so you're asking it what it was like for me. So, you know, I mean, partly because, I had done a lot of work with people who've been through trauma. I had done a lot of work in the 80s with people with multiple personality disorder. I was
Yeah.
very familiar with dissociation. For me, dissociation was completely logical, even though I
Yeah.
knew many, many people in the psychiatry department who didn't think dissociation existed, even though it was in the DSM. When I would have to hospitalize people, in the 80s, they would say, oh, this disorder doesn't exist. And I would say, well, that's an example of dissociation because it's in the DSM. And if you're a board examiner, which many of these people were, I would say you'd fail your boards because this is in the DSM, dissociative disorders. Anyway, so that's the background. So for me, it was a very comfortable place to be to say, my job as a therapist is to be with you in whatever kind of things emerge, knowing that sometimes, and this is my attachment background, knowing that sometimes, if we, well, just to parenthetically say, if we use the word self as a center of experience. And from a relational point of view, we realize our center of experience is emerging in a relational field within the family. So
Yes.
if there are really abrupt shifts, sometimes a parent is nice and sometimes they're sexually abusive. Sometimes they're nice and sometimes they're, screaming out of their mind and terrifying us, all the different ways we can be abused or neglected. So what that means is because the center of experience emerges within a relational field,
Yes.
those quite distinct relational fields in a family that's so chaotic like that and abusive is not only be terrifying, but it's going to induce different self states, that is, different centers of experience that we call a self, to create a state of brain activation that if the person's lucky and they can have this brilliant adaptation, they're going to survive this family by having memory barriers between these self states, and those are called dissociation. And we
Yeah.
know this is a reality of how the brain works. So
Yeah.
for me, then it was just a matter of being with you when a self state would first emerge and wouldn't know about the adult self state that had come and driven the car to the office. Then I, got a feeling in my body like, ooh, this is a different kind of segmented self state in Sally. I don't know what it's about, but my job is to care for you as an overall person. And inside of you, clearly now, there's a self state that has arisen. So I become a part of it's almost like an echo of the field in which that self state was first born. So I might
Wow.
ultimately ask that self state, so how old were you when you were born? Which sounds like a funny question, but and you would say, I was 5,
Yeah.
or I was 8, or I was 2, or whatever it was. And what's your function? Oh, I'm here to, and I'll let you say what the different functions were, but I'm here to do this. And, and how's that going for you now? And how do you get your needs met? And, do you know about any other aspects of you? This kind of thing. So the reason at the end of a session, I wouldn't summarize it for you unless I thought it was a dangerous situation. That's a whole
Right.
different thing. But is that, part of the relationality is for me to establish a relationship with this part and not violate whatever survival reasons were that they've remained separate. And so to honor that I'm going to have a relationship with that part, that's going to be different than what the adult Sally would have with that part right now. And as time unfolds, we're going to do things in the therapy that will allow, for example, writing in a journal. So different self states can actually communicate with each other, through the journal and things like that. So that's why, I didn't feel it was
Yeah.
my job, nor did I think it was going to be helpful. Say, well, this is what we just did, this time,
Yeah.
because it was.
No.
You'll be able to sit in on it as you did later
Yeah.
on. Yeah.
And it wasn't that long after that I could start being aware. I could be aware in the room, even if I didn't want to really participate. I could be present and hear what was going on. And I remember the states coming into therapy, and I remember people always ask, how would you know? And what I remember how you knew it was a different state was, first of all, I'd almost always be hiding. If it was me, I wouldn't be hiding under a blanket or with a pillow. I remember that I could give you little finger um,
Signal.
messages. I think I made you often, and I talk about this a lot in the book, as part of this fantasy that I had, um, that you had to come find me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You had to ask, who is it? What, I wasn't always offering. And then there were states I remember that just came right up front and were like, kind of mad that they hadn't been spoken to yet. And I know we're getting close to where we're going to start with the Q&As, but I also want to say that the states that I was the most terrified of, which was a lot of them, because it all felt angry to me and dangerous. But what I learned, which I think is such an important lesson, is that almost all of them were, mad children, Do you know, they weren't dangerous, or they were mirroring the rage of my family, not my rage, right? So the terror was that, and so I would feel rage, and I'd be afraid that they were going to come in and burn your office down. And I remember you never being afraid that your office was going to get burned down, and you put some precautionary things in the invitation for a state to come. And almost always when they showed up, pretty quickly I was able to relax into it, and then I began to stay present for it, and then I could even have a conversation, be part of the conversation, and it just
Yeah.
started to unfold. At a certain point it became very, very natural within our regular sessions, is my recollection.
Yeah, that's my recollection too. And the journey sometimes comes to points where the internal fragmentation is becoming so reorganized that the safety of you required that we use a hospital setting. And also for us to do that work, not only for safety reasons, but it would be hard to continue to be a mom during
Yeah.
those days of intense psychotherapy
Yeah.
intervention. Now, I know a mom leaving a son is hard. So, Sam, I'm sorry, but sometimes it was absolutely necessary. So
Yeah.
there would come times when, the configuration of really an insane family that you had to absorb because you're just a kid was now being reorganized in such a fashion that it became so intense. I needed to make sure you were going to be safe. And to
Yes.
do that work, we needed you not in the role of mom and wife,
Yeah. Or driver.
or driver. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or driver.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
then we just say, okay, this is coming up. And they were all elective. It wasn't like it was ever
Yeah.
like, oh, it's against your will. We said, look, something's happening that the therapeutic journey is going to require, a retreat,
Yeah. I think
and
that's what I told all my friends. I was going on retreat.
we would plan it for when it was fit into your schedule and fit into my schedule, and we would do incredibly intense work in the hospital. And so sometimes you have to do that, and that's not a sign of therapeutic failure. It's
No.
actually a part of the therapeutic journey sometimes, often actually. So, and that's those moments when an internal part of you that had, identified with the aggressors in your family, needed to have their time to really express themselves. And the hostility could be expressed in a safe way.
Yeah.
And then other aspects of you could learn about things and understand, this was a necessary part of the work.
And I know we got to go for questions, but that's also what made me start to not be afraid of the terror and the terror, because I understood its origins. I realized there wasn't anything terrorizing happening anymore. It was all memory.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
Thank you both. Thank you. Such a fascinating conversation. We are going to move to the Q&A portion of the event now. So there are a number of questions from our audience, starting with a question from Sally. What happens to someone who can't dissociate to preserve their mind? So assuming a childhood state or someone who can't dissociate to preserve their mind.
That's a Dan question, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic question, and it's I don't know if we have the research that to answer it with empirical data. My sense is that without dissociation, there would be just tremendous amounts of shame that would arise inside of a person, because shame is an attempt of a child, when they're not getting their fundamental needs met, to not go insane. They go to shame, because with shame, what you think of is my parents are fine and I'm defective. And so, but that belief I'm defective then has a deep emotional outcome of that. So there's huge shame component, I think, when dissociation is not present. And so in a way, shame, then the person will do all sorts of things to be trying to not be aware of their own shame because it's filled with so much helplessness. So that's a different course. If there's no dissociation and there's tons of shame, that would be one way of dealing with it. And then working, with that individual's hidden belief, I'm defective, is what that therapeutic work is all about.
Okay, another question from Cassie for you, Sally. How has your own understanding of your DID diagnosis changed over the years, particularly after you became a clinician yourself and were fully healed from your trauma?
Right. So it's a great question. So it hasn't really, my diagnosis hasn't changed that much because, I mean, now I'm very thankful for the diagnosis and thankful for the incredible healing journey I had with Dr. Siegel, Dan. So I'm very solid in that. One of the reasons I wrote the book was because as a clinician now, and especially my experience when I went to get my master's and in my formal training and getting my hours to become a therapist, I realized that I don't think I ever met anyone who was a professor or instructor or someone I was training with that understood what DID was or MPD was the way I understood it. And that the way that Dan treated it didn't, they weren't talking about it in any way having to do with the mind. And some people still didn't even believe that it existed. So, and I mean, it's not that bad now, but a few years ago, Dan and I did a course together, and the question people asked was, it just became clear to me. I don't think I haven't met anybody in a long time that doesn't believe it exists anymore. But I don't think people have as clear an understanding of its origins as I was fortunate enough to have because Dan knew it so well. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. So I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding about DID and a lot of misunderstanding about how to treat it. There seem to be a lot of different ways to treat it. And I just don't think, I mean, listen, anybody with DID therapy is very complex and takes a long time, but it's not, it's that relational piece really that is the linchpin for it all. And I see a lot of misconceptions in that department. I'm really hoping the book will help clinicians update their files about how to think about DID and how to treat it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Let's see. Josette asks, wondering what were the symptoms and presentation, Sally, and how did you know from visiting your family?
So I went to visit my family, not that, I mean, we hadn't been working that long together, but I was really clear that something was going on with me and it was related to my childhood. And I'd had some very strange conversations with a sister that didn't make sense to me either, except it seemed that she did seem to not be shocked that perhaps something bad, as I would say, had happened to me as a kid. So I went to visit my parents and I took my son Sam with me, Sam was very young. He was just three then, I guess, 2.5 or 3. And I took him because I'd never left him yet, so I took him with me, and a friend met me there who I'd grown up with and who knew what was going on with me and knew my family. And the minute I was with my parents, I started the feelings, they weren't implicit anymore. I mean, I guess they were implicit, but they were very present. But then something very explicit started to happen to me, and I realized, and it's going to make me cry, I felt Sam was in danger. I felt Sam was in danger because they were dangerous and I couldn't get him out of there fast enough. And I never saw them again after that. Never saw them again after that. It was very present.
Yeah, and you talk about that in the book a little bit as well.
I
Yeah.
do. Yeah, it's a big part of it was a real turning point in therapy for me.
Yeah. Okay, another question from AH. Sally, in hindsight, Did you have any awareness of your states prior to starting therapy?
I didn't know they were states. I knew here's how I when I look back on it, I see the signs, right? I first had no memory, not just of childhood. I had big gaps of memory in just in my everyday life. And I just thought it was bad memory. Like having a good childhood. I didn't think it was weird that I didn't have memory of things. And I have some very distinct memories, especially in adolescence, of being with a group of people and wanting to partake in the conversation or whatever was going on, and just being frozen inside and not, like, I just almost could. I mean, I had to. I don't even exactly know how I organized it, but I just couldn't be a part of the conversation or the activity. And I realize now that that was some state of terror, not allowing me to take part in whatever. And I don't know exactly why, but when I look back on that now, and I have lots of memories of times like that through adolescence and adulthood until I met Dr. Siegel, that I didn't understand what was going on emotionally, regulation wise, and in my thoughts, and they seemed um, chaotic. But I didn't think it was weird. Is the strange thing. Yeah. Do you remember anything like that?
Um,
Me about that, Dan, at all? About my
No, I mean,
awareness
I think
before?
it's a really great and fundamental question,
Yeah.
that uh, people, I think, puzzles everybody, like how can you have this significant amount of division without an awareness of it? And that's because of the very nature of it, that um, the dissociation is a discontinuity in not only memory but in consciousness, so that when a self state, this verb like center of experience, arises, with dissociative disorders, DID especially, it can then take over the entirety of consciousness. And so that consciousness doesn't know there was another consciousness here 2 minutes ago. And so it's just, oh, I'm here. I don't know exactly how I got here, or I
That's
don't know
right.
this person in front of me, but I'm just feeling like I'm me.
Yeah.
So if you think of self as spa, a subjective experience, perspective, and agency, there's a
Yeah.
spa for each of these self states. Now, you can think that they're noun like entities, but they're not. They're verb like processes, they're states. And so it's not like we're saying there are little people inside of a person
Right.
with DID. No, that's not how the brain works. It's not how the mind works. It's not how relational fields work. A relational
Mhm.
field can pull for different aspects of being that can have the appearance of being noun like fixed entities and little people inside of you, but it's not that. So
Right.
part of it, I think, from a clinician's point of view, is to start getting familiar with and understand how a state functions, and then
Mhm.
specifically how a self state functions, and then very specifically how dissociative barriers across self states actually create the condition that we call DID. And then
Yeah.
it's not like a mystery. It's just like, okay,
That.
this is
Yeah.
what the brain does under circumstances that are horrendous, and that's what the empirical data shows. And once you take on that, then the clinical work, I'm kind of repeating this idea, but is to be present for that relational field that is created in the moment. And that's, I think, what the journey was, Sally, as I remember it, is whenever you would bring a different self state, I had to just be present for that self state and just see what was going to rise. I didn't know what was going to happen. And
Yeah.
so as a clinician, I think you have to be open with an open mind, an open heart, an open whole system that you're going to now become a part of, with clear, professional boundaries and all that stuff. But you're going to become a part of a relational field of communication that emerges, and you see what happens. And that's how we learn. And then the data you got from your various family members, would then confirm the unfortunate things that happened to you as a kid. And so it wasn't just in the privacy of, therapy. We were always seeking what do we know from different communications with other family members, and so that's how it all unfolded. That's my recollection.
And what you describe is how it was. I felt it was a mystery to me. I didn't understand. I felt confused a lot about who I was. Um, but on the other hand, I also sort of knew who I was. I knew who Sally was, but I had a lot of ghost-like feelings. Like I couldn't figure out why something had happened, or somebody was talking to me about something that I had no memory of or no recollection of. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where, looking at it from the healthy adaptation point of view is so important, because otherwise it could freak you out. And
Yeah.
there's a question coming up, what kind of journaling prompts?
Yeah.
Outside the office, I would invite you to write in a journal, but, let that, there'll be, because of the way dissociation works, there will be states that will be writing things that you may not know about. And
Yeah.
so it's a matter of timing of when, to learn about that. But the prompt is simply to say, what does this self state want to communicate? And so there's internal work within a given state. Then there's the interstate, sounds like a highway, but the between state communication and understanding. And then ultimately the journey becomes, well, you can say what it was like. What was it like to find how your states, well, I'm actually, we want more questions, I know, but
No,
ultimately
I'll
we
just
should
say
ask.
very quick.
Yeah.
I had a bulletin board, which was just a journal. And I mean, when I would, wake up in the morning and go look at my journal, and there would be handwriting that I didn't recognize, and it would be a state, and that state would say who it was. And often it was someone that I'd already aware of through therapy, but it was always something that they wanted me to bring to your attention, because it was very hard for me sometimes in therapy to let states speak, because it just was hard. But once a state said that, then I could bring the bulletin board into therapy, read it to Dan, and then he would invite that state to come talk, and then I could choose to either be present or not. And I almost always chose at first not to be present, but then I would be present eventually. Yeah, and that's how I met all my different states. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Following on that, there's a question from Jules,
Yeah.
and there are a lot of questions, so I'll
Right.
attempt to get through as many as we can. But what is your relationship, Sally, like with your parts or your former self states now that they're more integrated?
Right. So I
Noting
don't
that
think of
you
them.
have,
Oh wait, sorry.
go ahead.
I don't
No,
think.
go ahead.
Can I finish, or do you want to read the rest of the question? Wait. Okay. I don't think of them as former self states anymore, because the integration is, I don't feel like states are separate, but I know that I am here because of all the different ways my dissociated self states segmented it off to take care of me. So that, unlike someone, as Dan was explaining a little earlier, that doesn't have the ability to dissociate, the whole of me was really protected. So I don't think that I've lost any of the self states. I think they're all me. And I think that I have a very well balanced way of being in the world, because they're all connected now. So I don't ever think of them as being separate. But I'm also know that as all people, have many, many different ways of being in the world. But I never think, oh, I'm being this now because of that. But it's just very seamless now, very integrated.
Sally, can you talk about how your therapeutic relationship with Dr. Siegel has shaped your own approach to psychotherapy with your own clients?
There's no way that I work with clients anymore that hasn't been influenced by my work. First as Dan's patient, and then his student still. And it is just as he described, to be with my client from the minute they used to step into my office, now step into my virtual office, and just sort of be there to invite them to bring what they need to bring into therapy, and let it unfold in a very natural, organic way. Yeah, I mean, and all the neuroscience. I mean, I am not a neuroscientist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a researcher. But I do know the value of having a base of neuroscience, and Dan's field, interpersonal neurobiology, informs everything to help, because I think the psychoeducation that I got with Dan in therapy is one of the big things that just really enhanced my ability to heal. So it's in every way. I feel like I'm channeling, him all the time. Yeah. Yeah, it's true.
That's beautiful.
Go ahead, Jan.
No, it's beautiful, Sally, because I feel like I've learned so much from you. And back in '91 when we started, it just started becoming clear, how to bring these different fields together that ultimately became interpersonal neurobiology, and that integration was the foundation for health. And so, in terms of this question, how did integration emerge in you? It's a relational process of honoring differences and promoting linkages that ultimately in the brain creates that same integrative process, so that these states don't have to be having dissociative barriers, and the emotional needs and functions that each of the states had for trust and loyalty, for sexuality, for fun, for excitement, for dealing with fear, all those basic ways that got segmented because of the way your family was, can now all be emotional needs that are met without dissociative barriers, because we all have different states, different needs that then engage us in different ways. And so it's not that the mind is just a big homogeneous uniform thing. It has these different states. The key is that the dissociative barriers are no longer needed. And when I think about your journey of therapy, you taught me so much, Sally, about how to have the courage really to see that what before was identified as a separate being that went through the trauma and that wasn't you, was you.
Was me. Well, and
You know,
that was, yes. And I can remember those moments when I realized, oh, it was me. This happened to me, which of course is why the dissociative barriers were created to begin with. So I didn't have to know it was me, because then I would have been that person that all that happened to with no protection. Yeah.
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 And that's why you're my hero, Sally, to
You're
go
mine.
through such a journey. And, it was profound.
It was profound for me too. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you. I guess that
Great. So we're
Yeah.
just about at time. Yeah. Thank you so much for participating, Dan and Sally and everyone who's here. It's a very thoughtful conversation. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. Sally's book, A Brilliant Adaptation, is available now from your favorite bookstore. I think there will also be a link in the chat if it's not there already to, there it is, Leslie posted it, for purchasing the book online. Thank you again for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
Elizabeth.
Sally. Thank you, Elizabeth. And keep up the wonderful work, everyone. And I hope these incredible lessons Sally's offered us will be taken in and bring well-being to lots of people.
Thank you all. Thank you.